Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity from Pugwash to talk. I gave a talk 2 years ago, I think maybe 1.5 years ago in Pugwash, to a little tiny group of people, and it was fun. And they emailed me and said, would you come back and do it again? So I was expecting a little tiny group of people, but we didn't quite get that. I am happy to see that more people are becoming interested in these issues, and I think there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that as I talk. This is a difficult talk to give, because it's not a technical talk. It's a talk about philosophy in a way, and emotion. And these things can be emotional, and they can cause emotional results in people. At the same time, I'm not a philosopher, and I will not claim to have training in that area and regime. So what I say is personal, and hopefully the beginning of a discussion that people can have. But in no way can it be taken to be the proper semantic philosophical approach to having these kinds of discussions in general. So it doesn't frame things right, if you will. Nevertheless, I'll act like one at times. So leave me that freedom, please. So I'm going to talk about ethics, and I think the obvious first way to start is to talk about my history, about my story of how I became a roboticist, and when I became aware that I was seeing something amiss that made me want to act ethically and understand what ethics means vis-a-vis technology. So I'll take you way back. I was at Stanford University, I was a student, and I took a class from this fellow, Terry Winograd. He's still a professor there. And it was an interesting time because what happened was a couple of things at the same time. I have sort of two slides that tell the story of how this transformation happened in me a little bit. One is that as I took his class, he talked about computer professionals for social responsibility. At the same time, I was working in robotics. And there was something like 4 faculty at Stanford in the computer science department doing robotics. They didn't talk to each other. In fact, they all had robots, and they didn't communicate with each other. They didn't really collaborate with each other. And I spent probably 6 months trying to get them to be in the same room at the same time in an attempt to get them to collaborate. And they met in the same room at the same time and then parted ways again and wouldn't talk to each other anymore afterwards either. It was fascinating. You know, it isn't that they were angry at each other or mad or unable to speak to each other. It's that they thought of their research as a silo, as an individual piece of work that they do with their group, and that research inherently doesn't involve sharing, even with somebody in your own department. I was really struck by that, and I talked to Terry a good deal about that. And I talked about the culture of the university and how one could try to change it. And I was really upset that I couldn't change it in that case. And he had this interesting counsel, which is he said, you can't change it from the outside, Illah. You can't change it as long as you're a student. Become a professor and then try and change it from the inside. And that's the only way you can possibly have any impact. And that was really interesting to me. It was very empowering to hear somebody say, you couldn't change it. Unfortunately, it was a rather high bar, right? I'm a lowly grad student being told, first become a professor and then change it. So, you know, both of those are rather hard steps to take. The second part of that story of where I started becoming aware of these issues has to do with this computer. This is the computer that I did all my PhD research on, and would sit there and hack away in Macintosh Common Lisp and write code for reasoning systems and then put it on robots and run them. What happened, which is really interesting, I had a fabulous advisor named Mike Genezareth, who's still a professor right there at Stanford. He had given me the freedom to really work on a reasoning system and connect it to a really interesting mix, pick-and-place robot arm called Roboworld that was able to create little circuit boards. And that was my world. That was where I did all my research. His funders were the Office of Naval Research. And the Office of Naval Research started becoming more interested in something with a little more literal application to the kinds of issues that they were facing. And so they asked him, hey, how about you do a demo for us where you're actually sort of doing AI around the question of targeting a weapon, say, for firing. And so he told me, hey, Illah, this pick and place is great, but now let's do a demo for them for a couple of weeks from now for targeting a weapon. And that was it, right? Suddenly I faced a decision. Now what do I do? My professor just told me to do something. Target a weapon? Holy smokes, this goes against me, right? This sounds weird, and I don't like the feeling of this. Pick and place is much more neutral than targeting a weapon. And so I thought about it and stayed up at night and said no. I said, I can't do that. That's a direction that I think is wrong. We have to do research where even the short-term goal as a demonstration vehicle is something we actually believe in. We want that use to occur. This is the joke, right? That you want to make product that you believe you want people to use. You don't want to make products that you hope nobody ever has to use, right? So his response was, okay, good, do what you feel is right. And he supported me for the rest of my PhD and never asked me to do that kind of research again. Now, I was lucky. I had a professor who was willing to be that flexible with me and who took my no in a very, very well-meaning way. But that's what got me really going with this idea that even as a grad student, you can suddenly be faced with a decision that you can easily be intimidated into not making a decision, that you can easily be intimidated into not thinking about and simply acting, because that's what you've been trained to do. That's where I became interested in these topics. And when I came to Carnegie Mellon and started teaching classes here, I taught a class called MERPL, Mobile Robot Programming Lab, where we had lots of students programming robots in cardboard mazes and contests. They had little cameras on them and magnets to pick up gold pieces. And these students learned all about robot programming. And in this class, every year I had one special section on ethics and robotics. And I'd ask a number of questions in this section about medical robotics, about defense robotics, about whether there should be lines that robots shouldn't cross. Are there actions or decisions that robots shouldn't make? And year by year, I asked these questions very rhetorically, without interjecting my own opinions at all, to see what the students would respond. How would they take this? How would they debate with each other? And I would say that in 97, 98, 99, I got fierce, wonderful debates. There would be people in the class who believed robots are nothing but a simple extension of the current technologies. And there were people in the class who believed robots should never make life or death decisions. So what struck me as odd is that by 2004, I didn't have any debate anymore. Everybody in the classes agreed year after year, you should just let technology go whatever direction it's going to go. It's going to anyway. We can't control it. And so that was really interesting to see a transformation in the people in the classroom, rather significant transformation from an honest debate to a situation where everybody was saying, well, it's just technology. It's going to be used in many ways. We don't really have control over that. And that's really where I started, I should tell you where that comes from. I started talking to my colleagues in robotics, and I described the situation. And one colleague in robotics said something that I thought was just a fabulous quote. And so I'm reproducing it for you. Of course, I won't credit the person because I'm going to dissect it, right? But what my colleague said is this: we live in a dangerous world, and I'll do anything to protect my daughters. It's an incredible quote on so many levels, if you think and analyze about that. First of all, this quote is creating a casting of the world, a dangerous world. A casting that is stereotyped and so broad that it essentially enables carte blanche about what possible promulgation our research results have. Because it's a dangerous world, after all. It's a dangerous place out there, scary. And it creates a sense of protection, a sense of heroism. I'm protecting my daughters. The work I'm doing is protecting my people, my daughters. So not only are you stereotyping the world into a dangerous place, but you're isolating and partitioning yourself away from the rest of the world. You're different from the they. And you're suggesting that you are being heroic in your technology creation effort because you're actually protecting your people. So it's a really interesting quote because it really licenses you, if you will, to not worry about the ethics of your action. Because what you're doing has a reason, and that raison d'être does not go away, right? The world doesn't suddenly become safe if you believe it's a dangerous world. And your daughters don't go away. They're always around. So you can always make them safer by doing the right thing. Not that I have anything against protecting daughters. I have a daughter. But it's the way that this constructs what the world is and what my relationship is to the people around me as a technologist that I thought was really, truly striking. And so we'll come back to that quote, but I think that's a really interesting example for you to garner what do researchers think today. And you can relate that to some of the recent press like the Wired for War book. I'll give you one more example like that and we'll dive into it a little bit. I ran a conference workshop, and it was a conference workshop at the Grace Hopper Institute, which is an institute devoted to women in engineering and science. And in this workshop, which was attended almost entirely by women, probably 1,000 women were in the room, we had a keynote speech by Helen Greiner, who was the CEO, I think, or the chairman, I think the CEO of iRobot Corporation, formerly known as IS Robotics. And she talked about robotics. She started out talking about the Roomba. And you can kind of imagine this. There's a whole lot of women who are undergraduates from universities all over the US in this room, literally 1,000 of them. And Helen's up front talking about the Roomba, talking about the market, talking about how empowering it is for people to be able to use a robot to clean up their homes. And you're seeing grins and smiles on the faces of the people in the room. It's a warm, happy room. At one point, 2/3 of the way through her conversation, she turned to the defense robots that iRobot makes and started describing them, showed the robots for bomb disposal and the other robots for being able to do surveillance, throw them through a window, they crash through the window and allow you to drive around and take photographs of people in the house. And as she described these war robots, these defense robots, you could sense a level of discomfort in the room, right? It was obvious that the audience was a little bit weirded out. They didn't really know quite what to make of this. They didn't know if they were happy or sad or glad. And this went on for about 10 minutes. And I was sitting near the front looking back at the audience, just totally curious. How are they taking this? What are they thinking? And then Helen pulled the masterpiece act on this. And it's true, but it's also rhetorically very compelling, and it's worth studying. She said, you know, you're probably wondering about the justification for making these kinds of robots. Well, let me tell you the justification. She pulled out some envelopes, letters. Letters from mothers. Mothers who had sons in Iraq right then and there as soldiers. And she started reading letters by mothers written to her, written to iRobot, thanking iRobot for saving the life of their son. Beautiful, heart-tugging letters. And I look back at the audience, and what's happened to the audience? The audience has entered a whole new dimension. There are tears in people's eyes. They're thanking God that these robots exist. They're incredibly warm at the whole idea that, oh my gosh, we've actually saved the lives of people, of the sons of these mothers, our soldiers, our people over there in Iraq. It was a transformation that was remarkable to me. And if anybody here hasn't taken a rhetoric class yet at Carnegie Mellon, it's very important to take that class and understand how compelling ideas and speech can be in changing people's minds. There were no questions at the end of that about the ethics of using technology in war, or whether that in any way changes our relationship to humanity, to social custom, to mores. No questions whatsoever about that subject came up at the end of that. And I guarantee you that if she had stopped without pulling out those letters, there would have been questions. And there would have been discussion about how do you feel about these kinds of robots? Are there kinds of robots you don't build? Is there a kind of robot that's not quite right to build? So again, it's a really interesting example of how we relate to our society and how we can justify, in some ways very rightly and in some ways wrongly, what we do. Okay, that's the introduction. Those are kind of experiences I've had that have been really striking for me. Now the talk is about ethics in robotics, so I have to explain to you what I mean by that. This is where I get to put on the philosophy hat that I don't have, right? I have to understand and communicate to you what I mean by ethics for the talk to make sense, and for the construction I'm going to show you to make any sense. So, what do I mean by ethics? And ethics has many meanings, and you can go Wikipedia it all day. When I think about ethics and I analyze what ethics means, there are some roots that it has on the Greek side that I think make a lot of sense. One is ethos, one is mores. And I think these relate actually to each other in a really nice way, okay? Ethos is really about personal character. It's in a sense about the individual and the makeup of the individual. It's about what makes us who we are, okay? Mores is about custom and culture and action. It has to do with what we as a society or a culture or a group behave and what generates and constrains the kinds of behavior that we have. So the two words together are really interesting as roots of ethics, because one of them is about the human and the character that the human has, and the other is about action. It's about doing. It's a verb in a sense. And when you combine them, the way I combine them, again, I recombine them kind of in a conglomerate way to try and say what ethics means, is the responsible conduct of an individual. So ethics is really about the action that an individual has and about how that conduct that the individual has is responsible or not, and how one justifies to themselves whether what you're doing is responsible. So this is all a very long way of saying I'm not going to talk about ethics in robotics because robots don't have ethics. And I'm not a proponent of the singularity concepts. So no, robots aren't going to surpass humans and have ethics and debate the ethics question the way we are. That's not going to happen right now. So actually, we're not going to talk about robots. We're going to talk about roboticists. That's where ethics lies. And the interesting question isn't the ethics of robotics. The interesting question is, what is the ethical and personal responsibility nature of the relationship roboticists have to each other, to their technology, and to the world? And that's the interesting question to ask and try and answer. So let's talk about that, right? Ethics of roboticists. So the first thing I did is I wanted to see what's published on this. ABET is a great place to go, right? Let's go straight to the accreditation board and see what engineers, as a kind of superset of roboticists, have actually published and agreed is important. And you go to the ABET dialogue papers, and there's a code of ethics. Oh, good, there's a code of ethics. Outstanding. Now let's go look at the code of ethics, right? So you go and open up the code of ethics. There's a fundamental principles page, the very top. Outstanding. And you can go look at this up and you'll find this. And the fundamental principles are to uphold, advance the integrity, honor, and dignity of engineering profession by, and then there's a list, okay? Now, I read this, and I, honest to God, expected that the list had to do with safe engineering, with engineering that conforms to standards, with engineering things that don't break, right? I was thinking like an engineer, like a technician. And I was expecting this to be about being true to your engineering profession. But I was very happily surprised to see that that's not the case. The first code that they have in the Code of Ethics conduct in ABET is this: using their knowledge and skill for the enhancement of human welfare and the environment. This bowled me over. I was really surprised and impressed that the engineering profession has chosen as number one on this list two things that are highly humanistic, may I say, hard to measure, and not at all related to directly the execution of engineering, but related to much, much larger issues around conduct. So I was blown away in a very good way. Human welfare, enhancing human welfare. I mean, this is big stuff. It almost tempts the engineer to ask the question, is the thing that I'm engineering, is the widget that I'm making actually enhancing human welfare? Wow, that's a really interesting question. And the environment? The environment? The engineer is supposed to pay attention to enhancing the environment. Fantastic. Fantastic that they're making that connection. To me, that's a really interesting place to plant one's rudder and say, there is a potential path forward. And so I had to show that to you because I think that's a really nice path. Now, what's this? Anybody know what this is? A picture of? Guesses?
A mine?
A mine, yes, this is a mine. Can you see the mine? Let me use your umbrella, Ken. My pointing device here, that's the mine, little pressure mine, anti-personnel landmine. Thank you. So that's a mine, and it's a scary thing to see, right? It almost puts hair on the back of my head every time I look at a picture of a mine, because you know the potential that a mine has, and you know how it can really change somebody's life. So I had another colleague at Carnegie Mellon. He's not here any longer, so this is even easier story to tell. He worked for the Department of Defense on a mine, except it was a smart mine. It was an anti-tank smart mine that had the ability to move. It could actually jump around. So the project was build a mine that can hop. Now, why would you want a mine to hop? Well, there's two reasons. One, if a mine can hop, then when somebody's walking around, it'll hop out of their way, so it doesn't get wasted on a person, because this is for tanks. It's supposed to blow up a tank, not a person. Second reason, if it can hop, then if there's a tank over there, it can hop into the tank, blow up the tank, right? And there's an interesting extra reason, right? It's not really a mine, it's a robot now. So anti-landmine treaties don't really apply. Now, we got into a debate talking about this technology and talking about what he was working on, which was the hopping mechanism and the decision making around that. And his point was, I don't see how you can be against this, Illah. This is going to save lives because it's going to hop out of the way of personnel. And that means an infant running will not get killed. They won't lose their leg because the mine will hop out of their way. And that's an entirely valid point. There's nothing wrong with that statement. What bothered me and continues to bother me and makes me wonder is how much to the systems level is it the responsibility of the engineer to think? You can talk about a single incident, a child walking up to this mine and it hopping out of the way and their life essentially being saved by technology. But do you have to go higher than that? Do you have to also consider how many of these are going to be deployed because they don't violate some treaty? Are these going to be used in a more high volume manner because you know that they're going to get out of people's way? And will the logistical tail be such they actually kill more people because of that? Right? Do you have to think at that systems level? How high do you have to go? When can you say, well, that's just too high. That's beyond my eyesight. I'm nearsighted. It's too far up. After all, as you go high, the uncertainties build up, right? You can't really predict it anymore, the systems level behavior. It's a really interesting question that bothers me. Or is it okay to go just one level up and say, in this one sense, I'm making the world a better place. I'm enhancing human welfare. I'm not suggesting there's an answer to the question, mind you. Now I have a movie recommendation, and I'm going to show you a movie clip. And then I'll actually start to try and describe to you kind of what the belief structure is under which I try to operate my lab and myself. This is a fantastic movie. How many people have seen this movie by Sidney Lumet? Okay, very few. It's, huh? You saw the remake? There's a remake of Failsafe?
It was like a live one. Not bad, actually.
Really? Oh, it was like real-time movie. Those are fun. So this is the one where Henry Fonda was in it, so it's definitely not the remake. It's the real thing from long ago, and some other famous actors. I have to set up the movie for you and then show you the clip I'm going to show you, and I'm going to spoil it for some of you to some degree, but that's life. And I highly recommend you see it anyway. I've seen it several times. So spoiling it doesn't stop you from seeing it. It's really an outstanding movie. It's a movie that was released almost exactly when Dr. Strangelove was released, based on a book that got sued by the book that Dr. Strangelove was based on. So almost exactly the same idea, released at the same time, big lawsuit ensued. This ended up getting released slightly later because of the lawsuit, and it didn't get any of the press. Dr. Strangelove was comedic, and the famous quote that the producer had was, "I can't see how you could do this topic without being funny. It's impossible to do this without being funny." And of course, Sidney Lumet does it in this. He does it without being funny. In fact, he does it by being very serious. What happens in the movie, to give you the synopsis, is that America has a fail-safe system to ensure that there's never errors made and never a chance of accidental nuclear war. And this fail-safe system is pretty complex, and it includes the idea that these pilots have a special box, an AI box, that tells them you really have to go bomb now. And once it's told them that, they ignore everything after that, because this thing can't be wrong, right? It's fail-safe. And once it said go bomb, you go bomb. And nothing that you hear will change your mind. Even the voice of the president won't change your mind, because it could be the Russians, right, acting like they're the voice of your president. So you get the setup. So you know what happens, right? The box makes a little blip, makes a little error, right? The system goes down, comes back up in the wrong state. One bomber goes toward Moscow. So the president of the United States, Henry Fonda, goes down to a like 30 stories below the White House, that special room you've all been to. And he's sitting here in this concrete bunker with Larry Hagman of I Dream of Jeannie, who's his translator. And much of the movie is the two of them in this room communicating with the premier of the Politburo, right? Head of Russia, Moscow. What's happening is this airplane, the US bomber is flying there. Henry's being very clear, Henry Fonda, as the president of the US, that this is happening, and I'm sorry, we can't stop it. We've tried everything. We just can't stop it. So what can we do? And so they're having this back and forth about what to do. Now, throughout this movie, up until this point, very near to the end of the movie, the part I'm going to show you, you've watched the developer of this fail-safe device and a journalist and a congressman chatting about it. And at one point, for instance, the congressman asked, well, what if it makes a mistake? Whose fault is it? And the general and the inventor of the device are in the room, and they hear the question, and they simultaneously say, nobody. And then they look at each other and giggle. And they explain, it can't fail, so it's nobody's fault. So nobody's responsible. And responsibility, the word responsibility and the word fault come in over and over again in this movie. And at the end, here's where it kind of hits a peak. When what's occurring now is Henry Fonda is letting the Moscow president of the Politburo know that, I'm sorry, we've tried everything, we can't stop it. And leading up to this, he's also said, I know that if I don't do something equivalent on the US side, you're going to launch every bomber you have, and you're going to annihilate the US, and then we're going to annihilate Russia, and there'll be nothing left. So I know that we're going to have MAD, and therefore, I'm going to have one of our bombers go and throw a nuclear bomb on New York City if Moscow really explodes. And we'll have a tit for tat, and it'll be end. No more nuclear war. So we won't go beyond that into full-scale mutually assured destruction of both countries. Okay? So you're pretty nervous at this point in the movie, right? It's quite something. Anyway, at this point in the movie, they're having a discussion between the premier and the president about responsibility. So let's try it and see if we can play this part. And this is, of course, Larry.
I have ordered our long-range missiles to stand down from their alert. Only that part of our defense that has a chance of shooting down your bomber is still active. We do not think we have much of a chance. I know. And yet, this was nobody's fault. I don't agree. No human being did wrong. No one is to be blamed.
We're to blame, both of us. We let our machines get out of hand.
Still, it was an accident.
Two great cities may be destroyed. Millions of innocent people killed. What do we say to them, Mr. Chairman? Accidents will happen. I won't accept that.
All I know is that as long as we have weapons...
All I know is that men are responsible. We're responsible for what happens to us. Today we had a taste of the future. Do we learn from it or do we go on the way we have? What do we do, Mr. Chairman? What do we say to the dead?
So this takes me to the part of the talk where I'm going to try and set up a model for you. It's a great movie. You should watch it. And he's making an excellent point. Is it possible for you to end up in a situation where ethically nobody's responsible? Or when you've ended up in that dead end, is everybody responsible all the way down the line? And I prefer the latter myself. So that takes us to the question of responsible conduct, ethics the way I defined it in terms of ethos and mores. How do I think about responsible conduct? I'm going to do this personally. I'm going to tell you how I think about it and try and act, just as an example of what one can do in theory. So I start bottom up at the individual, and I think about sort of what is your personal agency? What is it that you can do? And the question I actually ask at the personal level is, am I being truthful to myself? Am I actually asking myself all the time if my actions are what I consider to be responsible conduct? And am I acting in a way that's consonant with that? Completely at the personal level. It's almost like, are you sure that your actions are intentional? And they're intentional exactly in the right reflective way. So that's one level that I think is really important. But we aren't actors in a vacuum, especially in places like universities and businesses, right? Everything we do is suffused with a sense of community. We're always acting in groups. And so there's another interesting question that I think is much harder to answer, much broader, and much more difficult to come up with a satisfactory answer for, which has to do with collective responsibility. What role am I playing in the groups that I function in? And is my role, and therefore the role of the group as a whole, one that values responsible conduct and mimics responsible conduct? And that's a much harder question to answer, right? It has to do with, to what degree can I steer the group, or to what degree can I cause the group to be reflective, to ensure that the group actually is paying attention truthfully to what its actions are causing. So in a way I'm saying personal is not enough. You have to make sure that as much as is appropriate, you're having the right kind of impact on the entire group, the sphere of influence that you have within that group. And you know where the next level is going to be, right? It's obvious. It's the social good level, what Dick Buchanan used to call Gaia in the design department here, right? Are the collective actions that we take and the direction that we're headed consonant with where we want to end up as a whole culture or as a society? In other words, is the trajectory we're on truthful to the places that we actually want ourselves to end up in? And that's a really difficult question to answer because you have to predict the future. You have to think about systems level, the behavior that your collective has on the entire world, on society, and whether you're actually headed in a direction that you think is better than other directions you could be headed in. So I think of it this way, and I try all the time to think about whether I'm being truthful to myself, whether the collective that I have responsibilities in is actually being measured in their activity, and whether the direction we're headed is actually a direction that is desirable, that has some kind of social good. And yes, social good is a very loaded word. It's got serious philosophy behind it, but that's how I mean it. So that's one way of thinking about this from the bottom up, and I would suggest that as a consideration. I'm going to give you a very quick example, and then a couple of fun examples. You know, some of you may know about a project we have in our lab called GigaPan, which is a little robotic mount that allows you to take a digital camera and make multi-billion pixel panoramas with it. And there's a few people in this room that actually work on that project. It's a fun project because in a very inexpensive manner, we turn a single camera into this thing that makes panoramas that have massive resolution, incredible ability to zoom in and see things with great detail. Now, one approach to coming up with something like this is, as a geek, you invent that robot, right? You make the GigaPan, then you start scratching your head and going, okay, now what can we do with it? What are the cool things we can do with it? But that's not how we function, and that's not how we got here, okay? And it's interesting to share with you how we got here. We got here by asking the question, how can we foster better humanization between children in different parts of the world? How can we cause cross-cultural understanding? We, honest to God, asked that question to start with. It's kind of funny, right? And the answer in our minds was about the power of the image. What if you allow people to do imaging in a way that's so detailed that you fall into the image, explore it, find details that enable you to have a conversation with people around the world? Because you're essentially exploring a microcosm of them. It's as if everybody on Earth becomes a Google Earth producer. They're making something that has extreme resolution and sharing it with others. So then we made the technology. As a technology that supports that idea of extreme documentation of your environment for the sake of being able to dive into it, explore detail, and share it with others. The technology grew out of the social good. And that's very unusual in a robotics department, in a robotics lab. That's not usually how you do business, okay? And I wanted to share that with you because it's kind of interesting. This is different from a standard thing NASA might do, where they'll say, make a Mars rover, these are the conditions, and oh, by the way, 10% of your budget has to be used for education and outreach. So you make your Mars rover, and then you go, okay, now I have an extra $200,000 that I have to spend for outreach. What are we going to do? Should we give it to a science center? Should we make a movie? What should we do? It's completely different, right? The creative act of being an engineer, the inspiration that you take away from your creative art, isn't being directed directly in consonance with the social good. It's an afterthought. Of course, you can do great good that way, but it's still an afterthought. This is a picture of the girls in Trinidad and Tobago, I think in Trinidad, Naparima Girls' School, who were communicating with people around the world using the same device in a very different context. But here's the big but, right? Even the best of intentions can easily lead to something that you don't want at all. This is a picture that kind of portends to that. Boy, could you do great surveillance with this thing. Wow. Make a 5 billion pixel picture from up here. You can look into all the windows down there in the church and see what people are doing. Do it at night through an apartment building, and you can see what everybody's doing in the apartment building, right? Even if we design a technology with a social good in mind for that very purpose, it's still entirely possible that people will use it for whatever purpose they want. And perhaps this has something to do with this constant cliche I hear that technology is neutral, that technology doesn't have an ethics, that it can be used for good or ill equally. Cliche, I say, because I don't buy that. The question isn't whether technology is neutral. The question is the technologist neutral? Are you being neutral by inventing that technology, or do you have something in mind with it that actually is consonant with your goals, whatever they may be, whether they're to protect America or to foster cross-cultural independence? I don't care what your goals are, but is your technology development neutral with respect to your goals or not? It's a real question. And one thing that's really interesting about our society, I'm getting there. I want to have time for questions and conversations. But one thing that's really interesting is we're empowering people around the country to be able to develop their own physical embodied devices, right? We're making it easier for people to build robots, not just here, but all over the country. And that can be good and can be bad. And again, I just want to point that out because it's interesting, right? Technology empowerment doesn't mean you just get lots of good devices. Here's an interesting example. Anybody remember this thing? Anybody? A few of you, just a few of you. Yeah, I guess this is old now. This is Atlanta, right? Atlanta, Georgia. It's called BumBot. This guy has a bar, and he has a parking lot next to the bar, and on the sidewalk and in the parking lot, homeless used to converge and sit under their blankets. So he took one of these three-wheeled machines that the elderly sometimes sit on and zoom around town. The elderly, people who have motion impairments. And he took a barbecue pit kind of thing, turned it upside down, put a high-pressure water jet on it, give it remote control. It has a high-fidelity camera. And he can sit in his bar, drive outside, and shoot high-pressure, high-velocity water jets at the homeless. And this got massive press throughout the US news system. And it's a really fascinating example to me. It's technology empowerment, right? This guy has become empowered. And how he's expressing himself and empowering himself is really sketchy. So robotics isn't neutral. It's the person. And at the end of the day, I think we have to think about our own scope of personal conduct. So, last part of the talk, obligation. If I were given the task of deciding what somebody's obligation is, here's what I do for me. And so this is kind of my recipe book, right? But I think there are actionable items in it that are kind of fun to think about in thinking about being an ethical roboticist. So what is my obligation as a roboticist, in my opinion? I guess my opinion about my obligation is pretty safe, right? I'm not treading on too many footsteps that way, just my own. So I'm going to give you three. One of them is I think it's an obligation for me to actively decide and become aware. Becoming aware means reading the literature. It means understanding as much as I possibly can about the possible results of my actions, right? It means blissful ignorance is off limits, in my opinion. In my opinion, blissful ignorance by me is horribly unethical. I have to know precisely what I'm stepping into. That's one. Number two, equally important, and I ran into all sorts of people who didn't do this. Deliberate. You meet a lot of people who say, I don't want to think about it. I know if I think about that, I'm going to get heartburn. So please, let's just not think about it. You want to watch a movie? You have to think. You can't just become aware and then decide, okay, now this is a difficult decision, let's not go there. I believe it's also only ethical that you explicitly decide to deliberate and make a decision. And what are you deciding? Well, you're deciding what to do. But, and this is where it gets a little bit weird sounding, but I think it's really important. You're deciding what to do, and you're deciding what you're not going to do. And what you decide not to do is just as important as what you decide to do. And I don't remember who told me this. It came up in a conversation with, I think, Terry Winograd or Mike Genezareth. But it's incredibly important for people to recognize that every time they select an action, they're also selecting all the things they're not going to do actively. They're deciding not to do every other thing that they're just phasing out of their life or giving up because of lack of time. And so it's not enough to say, this is good enough. I'm working on this cool, targeting and acquisition system because it's not too bad and I kind of like it. The question is, okay, you're going to spend 2 years doing that. That means you're not going to do a whole number of other things those 2 years. You're not going to drive any buses, getting people to appropriate locations they want to actually go to. You're not going to be working on any other technologies. So is that really okay? And I think to be truly ethical in your conduct, you have to explicitly decide, this is what I'm going to do, and these are all the things I could be doing that I'm saying to myself and deciding I'm not going to do. And that, I think, is a very important step. And when you get there, I think it feels really good because you've actually actively made a decision. And the last thing that's been kind of, I guess I call this optional. It's been happening to me recently and it's kind of fun. I'm having professors from other colleges telling me they're kind of observing us. We have this lab here called the Create Lab that doesn't do any defense work. It refuses defense funding. It only takes gift money. And it only works on directions that it believes have direct social positive good. So that's our litmus test. But now I'm getting professors saying, we're watching. This is interesting. It's a neat experiment. Can you do this for 5 or 6 years in a row, do you think? Can you bring in enough money doing this? If so, we'll do it. Now, that's a weighty burden suddenly, right? Uh-oh, now I have to do it, right? But it's an interesting burden because it's positioning that there are people who actually want to act this way, but don't because they don't think it's practical. Only practical considerations are stopping them. And wow, if that's true, that's fantastic because you've got minds you can change simply through action. So I think that's a really interesting result. Okay, so if this is the scope of personal conduct, you can ask 2 other questions and stop. One is, what's the obligation of a research group, right? If the obligation of the individual is to think about all these issues, does a research group have an obligation if you're part of a research group? And I'm going to claim, I don't know. But I think the obligation of a research group is actually, in a way, to think about all of those issues at a certain level of abstraction, to think about what that research group is doing and to actively decide on their own agenda, their own mission, their own vision. And you can ask the same question higher up. What about university? Does university have an obligation toward ethical conduct of research? There's an obvious answer here, which is yes. How that translates into action is a little more complex, right? What did Stanford do when they started doing some secret work? They created SRI, right? Stanford Research Institute, and eventually renamed SRI, not even part of the university. So sheave it off. Is that appropriate? I'm not sure. That sounds more like not paying attention and pushing it aside, right? That's more like ignore than actively decide, right? It's like defer the problem altogether, separate the problem from us. So it's interesting. I would say at the bare minimum, a university's obligation is to actually engender the right kind of healthy dialogue about this, right? To create forums in which people actually talk about this, to create classes in which the students actually think about this and are informed enough about this to be able to be intelligent and intelligible in the research group and in their personal lives. So if it's a institution of learning, we should be doing that. And a whole lot of universities don't do anything like that, especially for their engineers, right? They may have some humanists who do this, but does the engineering folks in the university here get ethical training? How much do they get? And how far do they go with that ethical training? It's a good question. Last, what's society's obligation? Well, I see some interesting signs here, right? If as I said, I saw this kind of scary transition where debate stopped happening in my class on these subjects. It was happening well in 1998, 99, and then by 2004 it wasn't happening. People didn't seem to care, or they didn't feel that there was any line anymore. They were like, well, no, there already are Predator drones with weapons on them, so it really doesn't matter anymore. We've already crossed the boundary, and therefore it doesn't matter where we go. So people were they'd almost given up on the subject in a way. I think society's obligation is to debate this and to pay attention to it and to have an active dialogue about it. And I was happy to see Pete Singer's book and especially the reception it received, So Wired for War, because he is talking about the military-industrial complex vis-a-vis robotics. And I'm amazed at how much press it's gotten. And so that fills me with some optimism that maybe things are moving fast enough now that society as a whole is seeing the trend, right? Maybe the slope is high enough that people have noticed it. And maybe they're going to pay attention to it and have some dialogue around it. That would be cool. Well, that's a hanging question. I have no real answer. That was a maybe. And that's the end of my talk. So I'd love to hear comments and conversation. Thank you.